The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, painting the room in a golden glow. In a modest house at the edge of the suburbs, life felt peaceful. Melissa Johnson, 32 years old, stood in the nursery she and her husband, Mark, had spent months preparing. The soft pastel colors, the hand-picked toys, it was all perfect. Everything about their life felt like it was falling into place. Melissa and Mark had been married for 5 years. They weren't wealthy, but they had built a life filled with small joys, weekend barbecues with neighbors, quiet evenings watching old movies, and countless late-night talks about their dreams for the future. They had longed for children, and after years of trying, Melissa's pregnancy was nothing short of a miracle. Mark had been ecstatic when Melissa told him she was pregnant. He had dropped the toolbox he was holding and pulled her into his arms, tears streaming down his face. It was a moment she would always cherish. They had no idea then that she wasn't carrying just one child, but 3 triplets. 3 little lives growing inside her. The news had been overwhelming at first, but they embraced the challenge. Mark had taken on extra hours at work to prepare for the expenses, while Melissa threw herself into planning, filling the house with books on parenting multiples. She had even joined an online group for moms expecting triplets, seeking advice and support. As the due date approached, their excitement grew. Every kick, every flutter, felt like a small miracle. Melissa often stayed up late, imagining what life would be like once the babies arrived. Would they have her eyes or Mark's curly hair? She couldn't wait to meet them. Neither could Mark. On a crisp April morning, Melissa went into labor. It was earlier than expected, but not unusual for triplets. The drive to the hospital was quiet except for the occasional murmur of reassurance from Mark. He held her hand tightly as they walked into the maternity ward, a mixture of nerves and excitement etched on his face. The delivery was long, but successful. One by one, the babies were placed into Melissa's arms. Tiny, perfect, and full of life. She looked at them with awe, tears streaming down her cheeks. But as she turned to share this moment with Mark, she noticed something strange. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face had turned pale, his eyes locked on the babies with an expression she couldn't quite place. Mark didn't say a word at first. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the infants. Melissa called his name softly, confusion creeping into her voice. But he didn't respond. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft cries of the newborns. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Melissa, what is this? Who are they?" The disbelief in his voice stung. She stared at him, not understanding. "There are babies," she replied, but his next words shattered her world. "They don't look like me." And in that moment, the life Melissa thought she knew began to crumble. The joy of her children's birth was overshadowed by a question she never imagined she would have to answer. The days ahead would bring challenges she couldn't yet comprehend, and a truth that would change everything. Before we continue, a quick reminder. Over 80% of our viewers haven't subscribed to this channel. If you believe in the fight against racism and want to support stories that inspire change, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can say no to racism and promote understanding. Thank you for your support. The hours after the triplets' birth passed in a haze for Melissa. Exhausted and overwhelmed, she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Her husband's words echoed in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. She replayed the moment over and over again. His cold stare, the disbelief in his voice, and the way he had walked out without looking back. She waited for him to return, hoping that once the shock wore off, he would come back with the same warm smile she'd known for years. But the hours turned into days, and Mark didn't come back to the hospital. Not once. When Melissa was discharged, the reality of her situation hit her like a wave. She left the hospital alone, carrying 3 fragile newborns in her arms, unsure of where to go. The home they had built together no longer felt like a safe haven. It wasn't just Mark's absence. It was the fear of what would happen if she stepped through that front door. Melissa hesitated at the driveway for what felt like an eternity. Her key hovered above the lock as her heart raced. Finally, she opened the door. The house was quiet, eerily so. She called out his name, but the silence that followed was louder than any response could have been. In the nursery they had once painted together, Melissa found Mark's wedding ring placed neatly on the changing table. Next to it was a note, hastily written in his familiar handwriting. It read, "I can't do this. I'm sorry." Nothing more. No explanation. No goodbye. For the first time since their wedding day, Melissa felt truly alone. But there was no time to grieve or to process the betrayal. Her babies needed her. She had 3 mouths to feed, 3 lives to nurture, and no partner to lean on. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. Every time she looked into the faces of her children, she felt both love and pain. They were innocent, but their very existence had unraveled the life she had worked so hard to build. The fallout extended far beyond the walls of her home. News of the triplets' birth spread quickly in their small community, but not in the way Melissa had hoped. Whispers began to circulate. Questions about the baby's appearance, about Melissa's faithfulness, about what could have gone wrong. She became the center of a storm she hadn't seen coming. At the grocery store, she noticed the way people glanced at her, then quickly looked away when she caught their eye. Neighbors she had known for years suddenly avoided her. Even the cashier, who used to chat with her about weekend plans, seemed awkward and distant now. Melissa's phone didn't stop ringing, but it wasn't out of concern. Friends and acquaintances bombarded her with thinly veiled accusations disguised as questions. How are you holding up? Are you sure there's no mistake? What does Mark think? Each call left her feeling more isolated than the last. She decided to stop answering altogether. It was easier that way. The only voices she wanted to hear were the soft coos and cries of her babies. But then came the final blow. One evening, as she sat in the living room nursing one of the triplets, a loud knock echoed through the house. She opened the door to find her landlord standing on the porch, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, Melissa," he said, avoiding her eyes, "but I've been getting complaints from the neighbors. They're uncomfortable with everything that's going on. I think it's best if you find another place to stay." Melissa couldn't believe what she was hearing. "But I've never missed a rent payment," she protested. "My children and I have nowhere else to go." The landlord shifted uncomfortably, mumbling something about protecting the reputation of the neighborhood. And just like that, the one stable piece of her life was ripped away. Forced to pack up her life in a matter of days, Melissa found herself living out of her car. Her once bright future felt distant and unreachable. But despite everything, she refused to give up. She found a shelter that would take her and the babies in, a small place with limited space but a lot of heart. It wasn't the life she had envisioned, but it was a start. Each day, she worked tirelessly to care for her children, holding on to the hope that things would get better. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question that haunted her. Why had this happened to her family? And where was Mark? As the weeks turned into months, Melissa began to piece together the fragments of her life. She took odd jobs, saved every penny, and started searching for a new place to call home. But the answers she sought about her husband and the rejection she faced seemed further away than ever. And then, one evening, as she was rocking the triplets to sleep, she received a message that would send her on a journey she never expected. A journey to uncover the truth about her family, her children, and herself. Life at the shelter wasn't easy, but it gave Melissa something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of stability. The staff was kind, the other residents supportive, and for the first time since leaving the hospital, she felt safe. But the question still lingered. Why did her children look so different? Why had Mark been so sure of his accusations? And why had everything unraveled so quickly? The answers seemed impossible to find, but one evening, as the triplets lay peacefully asleep, Melissa received an unexpected message. It was from Mark's sister, Chloe, someone she hadn't spoken to since the fallout. Chloe's text was simple: "I need to talk to you. There's something you should know." Melissa hesitated, her thumb hovering over the reply button. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to shut the door on Mark's family and everything they had put her through. But another part of her, a part she couldn't ignore, needed to know what Chloe had to say. She finally replied, "What is it?" Chloe didn't want to talk over text. Instead, she asked Melissa to meet her at a small cafe on the edge of town. The next afternoon, Melissa sat nervously at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. When Chloe arrived, her face was pale, her expression uneasy. She sat down across from Melissa and wasted no time. "I don't know how to say this," Chloe began, her voice trembling slightly. "But there's something about our family, about Mark, that you don't know." Melissa's heart raced. Chloe explained that their family had always been proud of their ancestry, tracing their lineage back for generations. But there was one branch of the family tree that had been deliberately erased. Years ago, their great-grandmother had a relationship with a man of African descent. Their child, Chloe and Mark's grandmother, had inherited his features, a fact that had been quietly hidden to protect the family's reputation at the time. Melissa was stunned. She tried to process the implications of what Chloe was saying. If Mark's family had mixed ancestry, could it be possible that the triplets had inherited those traits? But why hadn't Mark known? Why had he been so quick to accuse her? Chloe sighed. "Mark doesn't know," she admitted. "Our parents never told us. They didn't think it mattered anymore. But when I saw pictures of your babies, I started wondering, and I did some digging." Chloe pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were old photographs, letters, and even a marriage certificate confirming their great-grandmother's relationship. Melissa stared at the evidence, her mind reeling. It made sense in a way she hadn't expected, but it also raised more questions. Why had Mark's parents chosen to keep this part of their history a secret? And how could she ever convince him of the truth now that he was gone? As if reading her mind, Chloe said, "You need to talk to Mark. He deserves to know." But Melissa wasn't so sure. After everything he had put her through, could she really face him again? And even if she did, would he believe her? The encounter with Chloe left Melissa shaken but determined. She decided to dig deeper into her own family history, hoping to understand if her ancestry could also explain the triplets' features. She contacted her parents, who had been distant ever since the fallout. At first, they were hesitant to talk, but eventually, her mother revealed a truth she had been hiding for years. "Your great-grandfather," her mother said quietly, "was black. My parents made us promise never to talk about it. They wanted us to fit in, to avoid trouble." Melissa felt a wave of emotions. Anger at the secrets, sadness at the lost history, and a strange sense of connection to a part of her family she had never known. Armed with this new knowledge, Melissa began to see her triplets in a new light. They weren't a mystery or a mistake. They were a beautiful reminder of the diverse history that had shaped her and Mark's families. But the question remained, would Mark ever be able to see them the same way? Determined to find closure, Melissa reached out to a geneticist who specialized in ancestry testing. She wanted undeniable proof that the triplets' features were the result of both her and Mark's hidden family histories. The process was long, and the wait for the results felt endless. But when the report finally arrived, it confirmed everything she suspected. The triplets' traits were a perfect blend of recessive genes from both sides of their family tree. Melissa stared at the report, tears streaming down her face. It was the truth she had been searching for, but it wasn't enough. She knew she had to share it with Mark. She couldn't move forward until he understood what had really happened. With a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed his number. For the first time in months, he answered. It had been nearly a year since Melissa had seen Mark, and yet, when she heard his voice on the other end of the line, it was as if no time had passed. He sounded hesitant, unsure of how to speak to her after everything that had happened. But Melissa didn't call to revisit old wounds. She had something to share, something that could finally bring clarity to the chaos that had consumed both their lives. "Mark," she began, her voice steady but firm, "there's something you need to know about our children, about our families." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Melissa wondered if he had hung up. But then he spoke, his tone guarded. "Melissa, I don't think we should," she interrupted, not wanting him to shut the conversation down before she could explain. "Please, just listen. I've learned things about my past and yours that change everything." After a long pause, Mark finally agreed to meet. They decided on neutral ground. a park they had often visited together in happier times. The sight of him sitting on a bench, his head bowed as he fidgeted with his hands, brought a wave of emotions Melissa wasn't prepared for. But she pushed them aside. This wasn't about their past. It was about their children's future. "Thank you for coming," she said as she sat down across from him. Mark nodded but didn't meet her eyes. His once confident demeanor was gone, replaced by a man weighed down by regret and confusion. "I almost didn't," he admitted quietly. "But I owe it to you, and to them, to hear you out." Melissa took a deep breath and began to explain everything. Her conversation with Chloe, the hidden truths about his family, and the revelations about her own ancestry. She handed him the genetic report, the photographs, and the letters that Chloe had uncovered. "Mark," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "our children are a reflection of us. Of both of us. This isn't about betrayal or mistakes. It's about history. A history neither of us knew." Mark sat in silence, staring at the papers in his hands. His expression shifted from disbelief to realization, and finally to something Melissa hadn't seen in a long time: vulnerability. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. I didn't know," he said softly. "I thought I knew who I was, where I came from. But now I see how much of it was hidden." For the first time, Melissa saw the cracks in the armor he had worn so tightly. Mark had been carrying the weight of his own misconceptions, his own fears, and they had blinded him to the truth. As they talked, Mark began to open up about the pain and guilt he had been carrying since the day he left. He admitted that his reaction had been driven by fear. Fear of what others would think. Fear of losing control over a life he thought he understood. "I was wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I was so wrong, and I've been too ashamed to admit it. Every day since I left, I've thought about you, about them, but I didn't know how to come back." Melissa listened, her own emotions swirling. She had spent so long resenting him, blaming him for abandoning her in her darkest hour. But now, hearing his words, she realized that his pain had been just as real as hers, though expressed in a far different way. "Mark," she said gently, "the past can't be changed, but our children deserve the chance to know their father, to know the man I loved, the man I still believe is capable of being there for them." Her words seemed to break through the walls Mark had built around himself. He nodded slowly, his gaze finally meeting hers. "I want to try," he said. "If you'll let me, I want to be a part of their lives. I want to make things right." It wasn't an easy decision for Melissa. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. But as she looked at him, she saw something she hadn't expected: sincerity. She decided to give him the chance, for the sake of their children, and for the sake of the family they had once dreamed of building together. The first step toward reconciliation wasn't easy. Mark visited the shelter, meeting the triplets for the first time since their birth. They didn't know him, and he didn't know them, but there was something in the way he looked at them that gave Melissa hope. He brought gifts, small tokens of love, and sat with them for hours, telling stories and making them laugh. Slowly, they began to warm to him, and Melissa saw glimpses of the father he could become. But just as things seemed to be improving, Mark dropped a revelation that Melissa hadn't anticipated. During their time apart, he had taken his own DNA test after receiving Chloe's call. What he discovered wasn't just confirmation of the mixed ancestry Melissa had uncovered. It also revealed a family connection to a community he never knew existed. "I've been in touch with some of them," Mark said one evening, his voice filled with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "They want to meet us. All of us." Melissa was hesitant. She had barely begun to rebuild her trust in Mark, and now he was suggesting they bring their children into a world neither of them fully understood. But as he explained more about what he had learned, she realized that this was about more than their family. It was about embracing the history they had both been denied. Melissa and Mark's journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they couldn't yet foresee. But for the first time in a long time, they were walking it together. And what awaited them at the end would be more shocking and more transformative than either of them could have imagined. The day Melissa and Mark decided to visit the extended family Mark had uncovered was one marked by uncertainty. They packed up the triplets and drove to a small community several hours away. It was a journey filled with nervous glances and moments of quiet reflection. Melissa couldn't help but wonder if they were making the right decision. What if this meeting only reopened old wounds? As they pulled into the driveway of a modest house surrounded by tall oak trees, they were greeted by a sight that neither of them had expected. A group of people stood on the porch, their faces lit with anticipation and warmth. Some held signs that read, "Welcome home." Others waved excitedly, calling out their names. Melissa was struck by the diversity of faces that mirrored the features of her own children. Stepping out of the car, Mark hesitated for a moment, looking overwhelmed by the welcome. But one of the older men on the porch stepped forward, his smile wide and genuine. "You must be Mark," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Samuel, your cousin." Mark shook his hand, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know you existed." Samuel laughed softly, his tone kind. "That's all right. You know now, and that's what matters." Inside the house, the family shared stories and photographs, piecing together the history that had been hidden for generations. Melissa watched as Mark's walls slowly began to crumble. He asked questions, listened intently, and even laughed, a sound she hadn't heard in what felt like years. For the first time, he seemed to understand not just the roots of his family tree, but the importance of embracing it. The triplets, too young to understand the significance of the moment, played on the floor with children from the family, their laughter filling the room. Melissa felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was as if all the pieces of their fractured lives were finally coming together, forming a picture she never thought possible. As the evening wore on, Samuel shared a story that left everyone in the room silent. He spoke of their great-grandmother and the struggles she had faced as a woman of mixed race in a world that didn't accept her. He described her resilience, her determination to protect her family, and her belief that one day, her descendants would no longer have to hide who they were. "She would be proud of you," Samuel said, looking directly at Mark. "All of you." His words carried a weight that Melissa knew would stay with Mark for the rest of his life. In the weeks that followed, Mark and Melissa worked together to rebuild their family. It wasn't easy, trust had to be earned, and forgiveness didn't come overnight. But they both knew what was at stake. They began attending counseling sessions, determined to work through the pain and resentment that had once divided them. Mark also made a point to be present in the triplets' lives. He learned their routines, helped with bedtime stories, and found joy in the small moments he had once taken for granted. For Melissa, seeing him with their children was both healing and bittersweet. It reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with, and the potential for the future they could still have. But the biggest test came when they decided to move back into the house they had once shared. The memories of what had happened there were still raw, but they both knew it was the place where their new beginning had to start. Together, they repainted the nursery, replacing the pastel colors with bold, vibrant ones. It was a symbol of their commitment to embracing their family's true identity. Over time, the whispers in the community began to fade. The neighbors who had once avoided Melissa started to approach her with apologies, small gestures that, while not erasing the past, showed a willingness to change. Mark confronted his own prejudices head-on, using his experiences to educate others about the complexities of race and identity. He even began volunteering with organizations that supported mixed-race families, sharing his story in the hope that it might help others avoid the mistakes he had made. As for Melissa, she found strength in her own voice. She started a blog, sharing her journey with honesty and vulnerability. Her words resonated with others who had faced similar struggles, creating a community of support and understanding. What had once been a source of pain became a source of empowerment, not just for her, but for countless others. Years later, as the triplets prepared for their first day of school, Melissa and Mark stood together on the front porch, watching their children with pride. They had come so far, overcoming challenges that had once seemed insurmountable. "We did it," Mark said quietly, his hand resting on Melissa's shoulder. She smiled, her heart full. "No," she replied. "They did it. They brought us back together." In the end, Melissa and Mark's story wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about the power of forgiveness, the strength of family, and the courage to face the past in order to build a better future. Their journey had been long and difficult, but it was one they wouldn't trade for anything. Because in the end, it wasn't just about where they came from. It was about where they were going. Together. Thank you for listening to this incredible story of resilience, redemption, and love. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of the power of the human spirit. Until next time, take care,